1947, her body was discovered in a shocking state that stunned even seasoned investigators and haunted Los Angeles for decades. She was carefully posed in the weeds beside a Los Angeles sidewalk. Her mouth had been deliberately mutilated into what investigators described as a horrifying smile. Her killer? He was never caught. For more than 70 years, detectives, journalists, historians, and amateur investigators have chased the truth behind one of America's most infamous unsolved murders. A case built out of glamour, darkness, Hollywood ambition, tabloid obsession, and a killer who seemed to slip into the shadows of Los Angeles and disappear. This is a story of Elizabeth Short, a young woman with big dreams, fragile stability, and a life that never found the future she imagined. But history does not remember her simply as Elizabeth Short. History remembers her by another name, the Black Dahlia. Before we step into the shadows of this story, take a moment to follow, like, and turn on notifications, because the cases we talk about here do not always stay buried in the past. Some mysteries keep breathing, some names never stop echoing. And tonight's case is one of the most haunting, unsolved murders in American history. Welcome back to Haunted in Between. This is episode 6, The Black Dahlia Murder. Los Angeles in the late 90s was a city of contradiction. On the surface, it glittered. The war was over, soldiers were coming home, movie palaces glowed at night, the studio system still ruled Hollywood, and thousands of young people continued pouring into Southern California, hoping to reinvent themselves under better weather and brighter lights. It was a city where fantasy was not just sold, it was manufactured. Everywhere you looked, there were symbols of possibility. Actresses smiling down from billboards, nightclubs overflowing with music and money, palm-lined streets promising some new beginning, the belief that if you were beautiful enough, lucky enough, charming enough, your real life could finally start. But Los Angeles had another side too, a darker side, one that lived just behind the stage set, a city of organized crime, backroom deals, corrupt officials, exploitive men, private appetites, cheap rooms, false promises, and people who vanished into the machinery of the city without much notice. It was a place where ambition and vulnerability often lived side by side. A place where dreams drew people in, and the city decided what to do with them after that. For one young woman arriving from the East Coast, Los Angeles represented freedom, reinvention, and hope. Instead, it would become the final chapter of her life. Before she became a headline, before the nickname, before the photos, the theories, the suspects, the mythology, Elizabeth Short was a person. She was born in 1924 in Medford, Massachusetts. She was the third of 5 daughters in a working-class family, and like a lot of other children who grew up during the Great Depression, her life was shaped early by instability. When Elizabeth was still very young, her father disappeared. Not metaphorically, not emotionally, literally disappeared. For a time, the family believed he might be dead. There were fears he had taken his own life, but in reality, he had simply abandoned them. That left Elizabeth's mother to raise 5 girls alone during one of the hardest economic periods in American history. You can imagine what that does to a household, the pressure, the uncertainty, the effort of keeping food on the table, the emotional damage of being left without explanation. For a child, abandonment does not just change circumstances. It changes the story you tell yourself about what love is, what security is, and whether people stay. Elizabeth grew up in that atmosphere. Friends later described her as pretty, shy, and soft-spoken. She had pale skin, dark hair, and delicate features that made people remember her. There was something striking about the contrast in her appearance, a kind of classic beauty that photographs well and lingers in memories. But her life was never as polished as her image. She struggled with health problems, especially asthma and respiratory issues. Because of that, she was encouraged to spend time in warmer climates, especially during winter. And that detail, one that sounds practical, even minor, helped push her towards a different life. Because it brought her to Florida, And Florida would expose her to something she had not fully known yet: mobility, attention, and the idea that she could become someone new. As a teenager, Elizabeth began spending time in Florida during the colder months. And in Florida, life must have felt different, lighter, warmer, less boxed in. This was during the World War II era, and Florida was full of movement. Servicemen, travelers, transients, people in uniform, people between stages of life. Elizabeth worked small jobs when she could: restaurants, hotels, service work. Nothing glamorous, but what mattered was that she was no longer just a girl defined by her family's hardships in Massachusetts. She was entering spaces where strangers noticed her, and they did notice her. Men found her attractive. People remembered her face. She was a kind of old Hollywood look before Hollywood had ever really touched her. And once someone experiences even a little bit of attention, a little bit of freedom, a little bit of being seen, it can become hard to go back. Elizabeth began imagining something larger for herself, something beyond scraping by, beyond being one more struggling girl in a crowded family, beyond ordinary life. Hollywood became part of that fantasy. Like so many young women of her era, Elizabeth imagined California as a place where beauty and hope could actually become currency. Movies were everywhere in American life then. Movie stars felt bigger than reality. Studios projected an entire culture of elegance, romance, and transformation. To a girl who had known instability and disappointment, that promise must have been magnetic. Not because she was foolish, because she was a human. Because people want to believe life can still turn out differently. Because maybe somewhere else is one of the oldest dreams there is. So when the opportunity came to go to California, she took it. At 18 years old, Elizabeth traveled across the country to California. And at first, there was at least the possibility of family stability. Her estranged father had resurfaced after years of absence. And for a brief moment, that must have seemed almost miraculous. Maybe there could be reconciliation. Maybe the past could be repaired. Maybe California could become not just a dream, but a home. It didn't happen. The reunion between Elizabeth and her father quickly fell apart. The old fractures were still there. Arguments followed. Tensions built. Her father reportedly criticized her and eventually forced her out. So for the second time in her life, Elizabeth was abandoned by the same man. That kind of wound does not just reopen, it deepens. Now she was in California, young, largely on her own, unstable in finances, unstable in housing, and still holding on to a vision of a better future that reality was not cooperating with. What followed was a pattern that would define much of her short adult life. She drifted: Los Angeles, Santa Barbara, San Diego, back and forth through Southern California. She took jobs when she could get them: waitressing, clerical work, cashier positions, temporary roles that paid enough to survive, but never enough to build anything solid. Nothing lasted long. Her life became a patchwork. Short stays, temporary beds, acquaintances instead of roots. The constant questions of where she was going next and who, if anyone, would help her get there. And somewhere in the middle of all this, she kept working on an image of herself. Not necessarily out of vanity, sometimes out of survival. Elizabeth told stories. She reinvented herself, depending on who was listening. Sometimes she suggested she was closer to Hollywood than she really was. Sometimes she hinted at romances, engagements, or even tragedies that were exaggerated or simply untrue. To modern ears, that can sound manipulative, but it can also sound like something else: a person trying to build a more bearable version of her own life. Someone trying to narrate herself into a future that reality kept denying. She wanted to be interesting, memorable, wanted, special, and maybe underneath all of that, safe. Friends and acquaintances later recalled that Elizabeth often told dramatic stories. Sometimes she presented herself as an aspiring actress, sometimes as a woman tied to wealthy men, sometimes as a figure surrounded by romance, tragedy, and possibility. These stories were inconsistent and many were not true, but they revealed something important. Elizabeth understood that in places like Los Angeles, personality could be a performance. Mystery had value. Beauty had value. A tragic backstory could have value. Being ordinary, broke, and unstable did not. So she shaped herself, not successfully enough to become a star, not convincingly enough to build a lasting identity, but enough that people remembered her. And yet, behind the stories, her actual situation remained fragile. She struggled with money, she moved frequently, she often depended on acquaintances, boyfriends, casual friends, or sympathetic families for housing. She did not break into the film world in any meaningful way. She did not find security. She did not find the glamorous California life she had imagined. Instead, she lived on the edge of it, close enough to see it, too far to enter. And that edge is dangerous because it puts a person near people with money, influence, and appetite while leaving them without the protection those things bring. During World War II, Elizabeth fell deeply in love with an Army Air Force officer named Matt Gordon. By most accounts, this relationship mattered to her. This was not just another man passing through her life. He represented future, stability, marriage, meaning, a story that ended somewhere other than uncertainty. The two planned to marry after the war. Elizabeth talked about him often. She imagined a life with him, and for someone whose life had been shaped by men disappearing, perhaps this relationship felt like the opposite of abandonment. Then, fate intervened. In 1945, Gordon died in a plane crash shortly before the war ended. For Elizabeth, it was devastating. Friends later believed that this loss affected her deeply and permanently, and it is easy to understand why. If you already have life marked by instability and then one of the few solid hopes you've built your future around is suddenly ripped away, that can change the way you move through the world afterward. After Gordon's death, Elizabeth's life appeared to have become even more unsettled. She drifted more, attached to people loosely, moved more often, seemed to live increasingly from one immediate circumstance to the next. By the winter of 1946, Elizabeth Short was again in Southern California, still beautiful, still young, still capable of charming people, but also nearly broke, without stable footing and only weeks away from becoming the center of one of the most infamous murder cases in American history. And no one around her, not her friends, not the strangers who helped her, not the police who would later see her in photographs and reports, could have imagined what was coming. For Elizabeth, the final days began not with a dramatic confrontation, but with something quieter. A place to stay, ending, a ride north, a story about meeting her sister, and then silence. In early January of 1947, Elizabeth Short was in San Diego. She had been staying with a family who took pity on her and gave her temporary shelter during the holiday season. That detail matters because it tells you where she was emotionally and materially. She was not living the Hollywood dream. She was dependent on kindness, dependent on temporary arrangements, dependent on the next person saying yes. Eventually, that arrangement came to an end. Elizabeth needed to leave, so she contacted a traveling salesman named Robert Red Manley. Manley had met her not long before and agreed to drive her to Los Angeles. On January 9th, 1947, they made the trip north. Imagine that drive. Two people in a car moving up the California coast. The war is over. The city ahead still glows with possibility. Elizabeth, as usual, is in transition. Neither settled nor entirely lost. Just moving toward the next place where life might shift again. During the drive, she told Manley she planned to meet her sister in Los Angeles. But investigators later found that story was false. No sister was waiting. Whether Elizabeth lied out of habit, self-protection, embarrassment, or simply to make her destination sound safer or more purposeful, we can't know. But the lie matters because it was one more indication that Elizabeth's life was built out of partially performed realities. She often seemed to be narrating a better or safer life, just one step ahead of the one she was actually living. When Manley dropped her off in downtown Los Angeles that evening, it would become the last confirmed sighting of her alive. And after that moment, the timeline becomes fog. She vanished into the city, not in a dramatic way, not with a witnessed struggle, not with a scream. She simply passed out of the known world. And 6 days later, Los Angeles would find her again. You know what's weird? Most of the stories we tell on Haunted in Between happen in the space where your mind is tired, your guard is down, and things feel just a little off. Late nights, long edits, too much silence. And if you're anything like me, caffeine becomes part of that routine. Here's the thing though, most energy drinks make me feel worse. Jittery, foggy, like my brain's racing but not actually focused, which is ironic when you're trying to tell stories that require focus. That's why I switched to W. W wasn't made by some massive corporation. It was made by a gamer who got sick of the junk, sugars, dyes, big blends that do nothing but crash you later. W cuts all that out and uses coffee fruit extract, which helps with the mental focus without the sharp spike and drop. It becomes part of my late night routine, recording, researching, edits, staying present when the stories get dark. If you want to try it for yourself, you can use my promo code Haunted in Between for 10% off at checkout. Let's get the dub. The link's in the description. Now let's get back into the story. January 15th, 1947, Leimert Park, Los Angeles. The morning was cold and still. A local woman named Betty Bersinger was walking down the street with her young child in a stroller when she noticed something in a vacant lot. Something pale. Something lying in the weeds. At first she thought it was a mannequin. That may sound strange now, but in Los Angeles it wasn't an absurd assumption. Movie sets, props, discarded material. The city produced illusions for a living. But something felt wrong. The color, the stillness, the arrangement. She stepped closer and the illusion disappeared. It was not a mannequin. It was the body of a woman, severed cleanly at the waist. Betty Bersinger ran for help and called police within minutes. Officers arrived. What they encountered would become one of the most infamous crime scenes in American history. The body had been drained of blood. It had been washed. The two halves had been placed deliberately in the lot. Her legs were spread, her arms raised. Her face bore the most horrifying detail of all. The mouth had been cut from the corners upwards, creating a smile that transformed the body into something theatrical, nightmarish, almost symbolic. This was not only murder, it was display. It was as if the killer had staged the body as an image, a message, a challenge, a composition meant to be seen. And that detail changed everything, because detectives immediately understood one thing. Whoever did this did not simply want to dispose of a victim. They wanted the victim found, wanted the body noticed, wanted the spectacle. Investigators quickly determined that the murder did not happen in the lot. There was almost no blood at the crime scene. That meant Elizabeth had been killed somewhere else, somewhere private enough for the killer to take time. Time to mutilate. Time to wash the body. Time to transport and position it. Medical examiners noted that the severing of the body appeared precise, not crude, not frantic, not the work of someone improvising in panic. That led to one of the earliest and most persistent theories in the case. The killer may have had anatomical knowledge, perhaps medical training, perhaps military medical experience, perhaps experience in butchery, surgery, or mortuary handling. The mutilation went beyond the bisection. There were cuts and removals of tissue that suggested deliberation rather than simple rage. Investigators and later writers have long debated what those injuries meant. Were they ritualistic, sexual, satanistic, symbolical? Or were they simply the choice of a killer who enjoyed exerting total control over the body? The truth is, the crime scene suggested all of these possibilities and confirmed none of them. And within hours, the press was everywhere. Reporters flooded the area. Photographers rushed in. Newspapers began building a story before police had even fully assembled the facts. By nightfall, the case was already mutating into myth. And soon the victim, Elizabeth Short, would be given the name the world remembers, the Black Dahlia. The nickname came quickly. Reporters saw her dark hair, her preference for black clothing, and they tied her image to a popular film title of the era, The Blue Dahlia, Black Dahlia. The press loved it instantly. It was dramatic, stylish, darkly romantic, a perfect tabloid invention. And with the name Elizabeth Short, the real woman began disappearing beneath the story built around her. The newspapers turned her into an object of fascination, a mysterious beauty, a drifter, a femme fatale, a Hollywood hanger-on, a tragic dreamer, a reckless liar. Each writer seemed to create a slightly different version of her. That is one of the cruelest things about this case. Elizabeth was murdered. Then, in a sense, she was remade publicly over and over again. Her image was dissected almost as thoroughly as her body. Journalists interviewed anyone who had known her: friends, employers, landladies, men who had dated her, people who barely knew her at all. Some describe her as kind of a hopeful, some as naive, some as manipulative, some say vulnerable, some say careless. And while pieces of all those descriptions may have been true, the overall effect was chaos. The real Elizabeth got lost under layers of projection. The city saw what it wanted to see: a cautionary tale, a scandal, a morality play, a glamorous murder in a glamorous city. And meanwhile, somewhere out there, the killer could watch this entire spectacle unfold. Roughly 10 days after the body was discovered, the case took an even darker turn. A letter arrived at the offices of a Los Angeles newspaper. Inside were personal items belonging to Elizabeth Short: her birth certificate, her social security card, photographs, other belongings, and with them a message assembled from cut-out letters. It read, "Here is Dahlia's belongings." The items had been cleaned with gasoline. There were no usable fingerprints. The implication was chilling. The killer was not simply observing the media circus, he was participating in it, playing with it. He wanted police and reporters to know he had possessions of Elizabeth's personal effects. He wanted them to know he was close enough to touch the case from inside. Over the following weeks, additional letters and messages surfaced. Some may have been genuine, many were likely hoaxes. The case had become so famous, so sensational, that it attracted every kind of opportunistic cranks, attention seekers, disturbed individuals, and false confessors. But that only made things harder. The real signal got buried in noise. Police now had to investigate not only a brutal murder, but a bazaar of performative involvement from people desperate to tie themselves to notoriety. And if the killer truly was among those communications, then the media frenzy gave him a cover. He could hide in the crowd of voices. Over the years, detectives investigated hundreds of suspects: doctors, soldiers, bartenders, actors, club owners, businessmen. Police connected names: men with surgical backgrounds, men with violent histories, men who knew Elizabeth, men who barely crossed paths with her. Dozens of confessions came in. Many were false on their face. Others seemed briefly plausible. Some were made by people whose mental instability or hunger for attention rendered them unreliable. This happens in famous unsolved cases more often than people think. The more public the case becomes, the more it starts attracting people who want to insert themselves into the center. More than 50 people eventually confessed to the Black Dahlia murders, in one form or another. None could be proven responsible. Some suspects stood out because of their occupation. A man with medical training looked promising because of the anatomical precision. Another suspect drew attention because of his connection to nightlife and violence. Others seemed to fit psychologically, geographically, or circumstantially. There were theories involving organized crimes, theories involving powerful men with reputations to protect, theories involving Satanists, failed doctors, corrupt insiders, and men who may have crossed paths with Elizabeth in the final days after she arrived in Los Angeles. And yet, every major lead broke apart under scrutiny. No final proof, no clean chain of evidence, no moment where all the pieces locked into place. What remained instead was a fog of possibility, and over time, that fog hardened into legend. Many experts believe the investigation was compromised from the start, not because detectives didn't care, but because the case exploded too quickly, too publicly. Under the limits of 1947 forensic capability, crime scene procedures were nothing like they are today. There was no DNA testing, no digital trail, no surveillance cameras, no national databases that could rapidly connect patterns. On top of that, reporters and onlookers crowded the scene almost immediately. Information leaked, details spread. The killer, if he followed the newspapers closely, could adjust his behavior based on what police seemed to know. Media pressures also distorted the investigation. Police had to manage public fear, political pressure, tabloid frenzy, and an endless stream of false leads. And Elizabeth herself, because of her unstable life, shifting stories, and wide social drift, became difficult to map cleanly. The exact circumstances of her final days are still incomplete. That gap matters, because the narrower the victim's last known timeline, the tighter the suspect pool. In Elizabeth's case, the timeline opened into uncertainty at exactly the wrong moment. Where had she been after she was dropped off? Who had she gone with? Who had seen her? Who offered her shelter? Who had harmed her? There were answers in fragments, but not enough, and so the case never fully locked. It just kept receding. One of the saddest parts of the Black Dahlia case is how completely the mythology can swallow the victim. The nickname is unforgettable. The crime scene is unforgettable. The image of Los Angeles in 1947, unforgettable. But Elizabeth Short herself often becomes blurred in the process. So it's worth stopping here and remembering the simple truth. She was 22 years old. She had survived a hard childhood. She dealt with illness. She wanted more from life than she had been given. She chased reinvention. She made mistakes. She told stories. She relied on people she probably should have not trusted. She wanted to be seen. Those qualities do not make her responsible for what happened to her. They make her human. And maybe that is part of why this case still hurts people on a deeper level than many other old murder cases, because Elizabeth feels close enough to understand, not a mythological feature, because Elizabeth feels close enough to understand, not a mythological figure, a vulnerable young woman trying to build a life in a city built on appearance. And somewhere in that city, she encountered someone whose cruelty would preserve her name forever, while taking everything else. Months turned into years. The headlines cooled, but they never fully disappeared. The Black Dahlia case became part of Los Angeles folklore, a symbol of the city's dark underside. A story retold in books, newspaper, documentaries, films, theories, late-night conversations, and endless reopening by private researchers convinced they had found the missing key. That is what happened when a case contains all the right elements for immortality: beauty, violence, mystery, symbolism, public obsession, and no official resolution. The Black Dahlia stopped being just a murder case. It became an American ghost story. Not supernatural, but haunting in the same way. A presence that lingers, a question that never settled, a name that carries an atmosphere all by itself. Elizabeth Short came to California searching for opportunity, for excitement, for reinvention, for some version of a better life. Instead, she became the victim at the center of one of the most disturbing unsolved murders in American history. Her killer was never officially identified. Maybe the truth died with him. Maybe it still sits buried in half-lost files and misconnections. Maybe the answer passed through investigators' hands decades ago without anyone realizing it. But one thing is certain: Elizabeth Short's story did not vanish. And maybe that matters. Because however distorted the legend became, her name still calls people back to the same question, generation after generation. Who did this, and why? Next time on Haunted in Between, we leave the streets of Los Angeles and travel to a quiet neighborhood in Springfield, Missouri. A home, a graduation celebration, and 3 women who vanish without a trace. No signs of a struggle, no forced entry, just an empty house, and a mystery that has haunted investigators for more than 30 years. In episode 7, we uncover the chilling disappearance known as the Springfield 3. If you enjoyed tonight's episode, make sure to follow, like, and subscribe, and leave a comment with your theories, because sometimes the truth is hiding in the smallest details. Remember, we are haunted in between. You're not alone, you're in between.